Wyoming Territory, 1883, the first thing Kenzie Calloway noticed when she stepped off the stagecoach in the dusty town of Whetstone Hollow was that the man meant to marry her was nowhere in sight. The second thing she noticed was her trunk, her only possession after leaving everything behind in Boston, was gone. "Hey," she shouted, spinning around. My trunk was right there, but the driver had already clattered off down the road, the coach's wheels throwing up brown dust. The other few passengers had scattered. The man she had exchanged letters with for 6 months, a rancher named Emil Turner, was not standing where he promised he would be. Kenzie's heart pounded. She looked up and down the small main street. There was no sign of anyone waiting for her. Nobody holding a rose like he said he would. She dropped her carpetbag at her feet and sat on the edge of the wooden walkway, her corset tight around her ribs. The late afternoon sun beat down as she blinked back the sting in her eyes. "Ma'am," a quiet voice said beside her. She looked up and saw a boy no older than 9 with a dirty face and shaggy blonde hair holding a small cloth bundle in his hands. "I saw a man take your trunk," he said. "Red shirt, big mustache. He loaded it on a wagon and rode off that way." He pointed past the livery. Kenzie stood, her stomach twisting. "Did he say anything?" The boy shook his head. "Just looked around real quick, then took off." She pressed a hand to her chest. "Thank you. What is your name?" "Jude," he said. "My pa's the blacksmith." "Shop's just over there." She looked toward the forge across the street, where thick smoke curled up from a chimney behind a wide wooden structure. The sound of hammers striking metal echoed faintly. "Thank you, Jude," she said again, voice tight. He nodded and ran off, disappearing around the corner. Kenzie gathered herself, legs unsteady, and crossed the street. The blacksmith shop was open on all sides, the heat of the forge radiating from within. Inside, a tall man stood over an anvil, sleeves rolled to his elbows, strong arms glistening with sweat. He was working intently, his hammer falling in steady rhythm. She stepped carefully into the shadow of the shop. "Excuse me," she said. The man looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. His face was square, jaw dusted with stubble, and there was a faint burn scar along his left forearm. He set down the hammer. "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice deep but gentle. "My name is Kenzie Calloway," she said, her fingers twisting around the strap of her carpetbag. "I just arrived from Boston. I was supposed to meet my intended, Emil Turner, but he's not here, and someone stole my trunk." The blacksmith's brow furrowed. "I am sorry to hear that. You are saying Emil Turner did not come for you," she nodded, swallowing hard. "I am Silas O'Malley," he said. "Jude is my boy." "He told me what he saw." Kenzie's throat tightened. "I do not even have $1 to my name. Everything I owned was in that trunk." Silas stepped closer. "You have a place to stay." "Not unless the sheriff takes pity on me," she said, voice small. He looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me," she hesitated. "Why?" "Because I cannot let you sleep in the street," he said simply, "and I do not think you will find the sheriff much help." He lifted her carpetbag with one hand and led her behind the shop to a small house. It was simple wooden walls, a porch with a rocking chair, and a garden with early squash starting to grow. He opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter. It was warm inside, clean. There were framed sketches on the wall, one of a woman with kind eyes holding a baby, another of a boy grinning with a missing front tooth. "That was my wife," Silas said, noticing her glance. "She died 5 years ago. Jude was 4, Kenzie nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "You can stay here in the spare room," he said, pointing. "I will fix you a plate. You look like you need something warm." She did not argue. Her legs felt like water. She followed him into the small kitchen, where he scooped stew from a pot into a bowl and handed it to her. She sat at the table, holding the warm bowl between her hands. "Thank you, truly." Silas sat across from her, watching. "You said you were writing that man Turner for 6 months." "Yes," she said. "He told me he was ready to settle down, said he had a ranch, needed a good woman." "I sold everything to come here." Silas's jaw clenched. "There is no Emil Turner in this town, not that I have ever heard of." Kenzie blinked. "What? This is a small place. I know every rancher within 10 miles. "Someone lied to you." She stared at him, the words hitting like a stone to the chest. "I came all this way for nothing," she whispered. No, Silas said, his voice steady. You came here because you wanted something better. That is not nothing. Jude ran in just then, breathless. I saw him. Kenzie stood up quickly. The man with my trunk, Jude nodded. He went north past the creek, toward the gulch. Silas stood, grabbing his hat and a rifle from the wall. Get your boots on, he said to Jude. You stay here, watch Miss Calloway. Yes, sir, the boy said. Kenzie stepped forward. You do not have to go after him. Silas looked at her, eyes calm. You were robbed. That is not right. I will see what I can do. She nodded, heart thudding as he stepped out the door. Silas rode out alone, rifle slung across his back. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the land. He followed the tracks past the creek, through the gulch, until he found a wagon half covered under brush, a man sitting beside a fire. The man stood when Silas approached. You got something that does not belong to you, Silas said. The man sneered. Who says? Silas raised the rifle slightly. I do. The man reached for his belt, but Silas was quicker. One warning shot cracked through the trees. The man dropped his hand. Take off, Silas said. Leave the wagon. The thief took off running. Silas watched him disappear before tying the wagon to his horse and dragging it back toward town. It was dark when he returned. Jude was asleep on the rug. Kenzie sat in the rocking chair, her hands clasped tight. When she saw the wagon, her face lit up. My trunk, she whispered, rushing out. Silas stepped down. He did not get far. She opened the trunk, and tears filled her eyes at the sight of her mother's Bible, her sewing kit, the little blue dress she had made for her wedding day. She turned and threw her arms around Silas before she realized what she was doing. I am sorry, she said, stepping back. He gave a small nod. It is all right. Inside, she sat down again, the weight in her chest just a little bit lighter. I do not know what I would have done if you had not helped me, she said. Silas looked at her, his face unreadable. I did what anyone should, he said, but something in his eyes said more, and something in her chest stirred for the first time in weeks. It felt like something real, something steady. Kenzie glanced down at her hands, then back up at the man who had opened his door to her without a moment's hesitation. Maybe this town had given her something better than what she came looking for. She just did not see it yet. The next morning, Kenzie woke before the sun. The small room held the faint scent of linseed oil and iron, and the ticking of the wall clock kept time with her pulse. She hadn't slept through the night, her body still adjusting to the quiet, her thoughts catching on the edges of uncertainty, but it was the kind of sleeplessness that didn't bruise. She sat up and listened to the house breathe. From the kitchen, she heard the soft clatter of crockery and the low timbre of Silas's voice, speaking in that careful way men used when they were trying not to wake a child. Kenzie pulled her hair into a loose plait and buttoned her collar. She didn't own a mirror anymore, but she smoothed her skirt and wiped the corners of her eyes with a handkerchief that still smelled faintly of lavender. When she stepped into the kitchen, Silas was pouring something from a tin kettle into 2 mugs. His shirt was different today, undyed muslin, sleeves rolled again. Jude sat at the table, chewing on a piece of dry bread, his eyes darting toward her and then back to his cup. I hope you take it with cream, Silas said, offering her a mug. She accepted it with a nod. Thank you, he gestured to the chair across from Jude. There's eggs if you're hungry. I am, she said, quieter than she'd meant to. Jude mumbled, I can go feed the hens. Silas raised an eyebrow. You already did, remember? You're just trying to get out of practicing your letters. Jude groaned, sliding off the bench. Kenzie watched the boy shuffle to the other room and leaned in slightly. You teach him yourself, Silas nodded. He's got a sharp mind, but he'd rather be hammering nails into fence posts. She smiled faintly. I don't blame him. They ate in silence for a while. Kenzie cradled the warm mug and let her eyes wander toward the window, where morning light spilled over the garden rows, catching on the dew-laced leaves. A crow called once from the cottonwood beyond the fence. I'd like to earn my keep, she said finally. I can sew, mend, help with meals. I used to assist at a schoolhouse back east if Jude needs more structured lessons. Silas didn't answer right away. He set his fork down and looked at her with something steadier than sympathy. You're welcome here as long as you need. That doesn't come with a price tag. I know, she said. But I can't sit still while someone else is carrying the weight. He nodded once, like he understood something deeper than her words. There's a dressmaker in town, he said. Name's Mrs. Ellerby. She's always in need of hands when orders pile up. I can take you over after I finish at the forge. Kenzie pulled her shoulders back. I'd be grateful for that. She helped clear the table, wiping crumbs into her palm and rinsing dishes at the pump out back. The water was colder than she expected, and the sky had turned a paler blue. Behind the shop, the rhythmic sound of hammering had already begun. Later that morning, she rode beside Silas in the wagon, the wooden bench worn smooth where years of use had polished it. The road into town passed yellowing grass and the occasional fence line where cows grazed with indifferent stares. Kenzie kept her hands folded in her lap, her bonnet tied tightly under her chin. "You were married long?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. 6 years, he said. She was from Missouri, lost her to the fever. Kenzie looked down at her gloves. "I'm sorry. She'd have liked you," he said after a minute. She had a way of seeing what mattered in people. Kenzie didn't know what to say to that, so she let the silence fill in the space between them. Whetstone Hollow looked different in the daylight. The fronts of the stores were painted in colors that had long since faded, but someone kept the walkways swept. A dog trotted across the road, tail wagging, and a woman in a blue bonnet waved from behind a barrel of apples. Mrs. Ellerby's shop sat between the mercantile and a tobacco cellar. Inside, bolts of calico and muslin were stacked high, and a small bell above the door jingled when they entered. Mrs. Ellerby was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile easily. But she sized Kenzie up with a long look and nodded once. "You've got fine posture," she said. "Can you stitch a straight hem?" "Yes," Kenzie said. "Good. I've got 2 wedding dresses due by next week, and my niece has gone off to have a baby." "You start tomorrow?" Silas left her there with a quiet nod. When he returned hours later, Kenzie's fingers were pricked raw, but her heart felt steadier. She climbed into the wagon beside him and let the light breeze cool her temples. "You did well," he asked. "She said I don't ruin more than I fix," Kenzie said. Silas chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "That's high praise from Mrs. Ellerby." Back at the house, Jude had stacked kindling by the hearth and was trying to boil potatoes without scorching them. Kenzie took over gently, showing him how to test them with a fork instead of guessing. That night, after the dishes were done and Jude had gone to bed, Kenzie stepped out onto the porch. The stars hung low and clear. Silas was already out there, seated in the rocking chair, hands resting on his knees. She didn't say anything, just sat down on the step beside him. They watched the sky for a while. The silence felt different now, less like a void, more like a shared language they hadn't yet fully learned. Silas's voice came low. "You're not what I expected." Kenzie tilted her head. "What did you expect? Someone broken or bitter?" She thought about that. "I was, a little." He didn't argue, just rocked forward slightly, then back. "I've got no plans beyond tomorrow," she said. "That's all right," he replied. "Most days, that's as far as I go too." Kenzie nodded, her eyes on the horizon. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since she'd stepped off that stage, she didn't feel like she was waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She was already in motion, and someone was walking that path beside her, quiet and steady as the land beneath their feet. 3 weeks passed, and spring pressed in with more surety each day. The frost left the mornings slower now, replaced by a damp warmth that rose off the fields before sunup. Kenzie walked the short path to Mrs. Ellerby's shop each morning with a satchel over one shoulder, her skirts brushing the wild mustard growing along the fence lines. The work was steady and fine, her stitches cleaner by the week, and Mrs. Ellerby, though still unsparing with praise, began trusting her with bodices and sleeves instead of just hems. One Tuesday afternoon, as she was pressing a length of dove gray silk with a flat iron, the bell over the front door rang. She turned, expecting a customer, but it was Silas, taller than he seemed in memory, carrying a box tucked under one arm. "I brought something," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Mrs. Ellerby looked up from her ledger. "Don't block the light. Stand aside if you're not buying pins." Kenzie stepped out from behind the work table, brushing her hands on her apron. "What is it?" Silas held the box out to her. "For you." She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in cotton, was a hand-carved sewing box with compartments layered like steps. Each little drawer slid smooth as butter, and inside were spools, needles, and a thimble polished to a faint gleam. Her throat tightened. "Did you make this?" she asked, her fingers lingering on the grain. He nodded once. "Had some walnut left over from a wagon repair. Thought it'd suit." She looked up, her chest warm. "It's beautiful." Mrs. Ellerby grunted from behind her spectacles. "You'll ruin your eyes squinting at thread knots. That box'll help keep you from wasting half the day hunting needles." Kenzie smiled, but her eyes stayed on Silas. "I'll take good care of it, thank you." He shifted his weight, then said, "I'll be outside when you're done." That evening they walked back toward the house together, the wagon left behind in favor of the long way home. The trail curved past a windbreak of cottonwoods where the creek ran narrow and quick. "You didn't have to make that," she said as birds dipped low across the water. "I know." The hush between them wasn't awkward. It felt like the kind of silence that asked for nothing but presence. "I've been saving what I earn," she said, watching the light catch on the water. "I don't want to be a burden. You're not. I could board somewhere. There's a widow near the church who takes in women." Silas stopped walking. "Is that what you want?" She turned toward him. The air between them shifted, not sharp, not heavy, just something new settling. "I'm not sure what I want yet," she said, "but I know I don't want to be temporary." He nodded slowly. "Nothing about you feels that way." They didn't say anything more until the house came into view. Jude was in the yard, trying to teach the dog to heel with a strip of jerky. When he saw them, he waved the treat in victory before the dog tackled him into the dirt. That night, after Jude had fallen asleep under a blanket patched with old shirts, Kenzie sat near the hearth, mending one of his socks. Silas sat across from her, sanding a piece of oak for a stool he was building. Without looking up, she asked, "Why haven't you remarried?" The rasp of sandpaper slowed. "I didn't think I needed to," he said. "I had Jude work, the days filled themselves." She tied off the thread. "And now," he looked over at her, his hands still. "I've been thinking different." Kenzie set the sock aside. "What made it change? You did." The fire crackled low and steady. "Do you want to court me?" she asked, the words plain and unadorned. "I do." She studied him, the way his eyes held hers without flinching. "Then you should ask me properly." He set the sandpaper down. "Miss Calloway," he said, standing fully now, "would you allow me to court you with the hope it might lead to something lasting?" Kenzie rose. "I would." He reached for her hand, not to pull her close, but to hold it upright between them, his thumb brushing the knuckle in a way that felt more intimate than anything else he could have done. She didn't pull away. They stood like that for a while, the fire warming the quiet space between them. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to move the porch swing, creaking once before settling again. Inside, nothing needed to be said. The decision had already been made. The spring fair arrived on the edge of May, just as the cottonwood leaves turned fully and the air lost its bite. Whetstone Hollow only held a few dozen families, but they pulled together each year to mark the planting season with music, trade, and a supper table that stretched the length of the churchyard. Kenzie stood at the washbasin beside the garden, sleeves rolled, scrubbing dust from a borrowed dress. It was pale green, the fabric soft from years of wear, with faint embroidery along the collar. Mrs. Ellerby had insisted she borrow it, saying a dressmaker's apprentice ought to look respectable among the booths and bonnets. Inside the house, Jude was trying to polish his boots with a scrap of wool. Silas had taken the day off the forge, which Kenzie suspected hadn't happened since last winter's blizzard. He stood near the porch post, knife in hand, trimming a rough edge from the handle of a wooden toy horse he'd shaped for the raffle. "You going to bring one of your pies?" he asked, eyes still on his work. Kenzie dipped the dress once more into the basin. "I thought about the apple one, but I haven't had time to dry out enough cinnamon." He glanced up. "We've got a jar in the cellar behind the sack of beans." She laughed softly. "You've been holding out on me." "I was saving it." "Now seems like the right time." Later, as folks gathered under the sloping trees behind the chapel, Kenzie carried the pie in both hands while Jude ran ahead with a tin whistle tucked in his belt. Silas walked beside her, sleeves clean, a fresh shave softening the angles of his jaw. He didn't speak much, but his presence settled her nerves like a steadying hand. Tables lined the grass, covered in patchwork cloths. There were pickled beets in glass jars, loaves still warm, and a jug of cider passed from neighbor to neighbor. Kenzie set her pie down near the edge, then turned toward the music, two fiddles and a banjo tuning up beneath the sycamore. "You dance?" Silas asked. "Not in a long time," she said, his lips twitched. "I nearly forgot how." She watched him as he looked toward the clearing where couples were forming a line. The last of the sunlight caught in his hair and she felt that quiet pull again, low in her chest. "I'd try if you asked." He offered his hand, palm rough, fingers long and sure. She took it. The reel was simple, the kind meant to keep laughter high and feet moving. Kenzie's steps were cautious at first, but Silas's grip was firm and patient, guiding her around the circle with the rhythm of a man who worked with weight and timing every day. She caught the glint in his eye once when she missed a turn and laughed, and the sound surprised her with how freely it came. When the music slowed and the sun dipped behind the ridge, they stepped away from the circle and found the edge of the field where the grass grew tall. Jude had fallen asleep beneath a table, a dog curled beside him. "Look at him," Silas said, kneeling to tuck a blanket over the boy's legs. "He'll wake up sticky with honey and dust." Kenzie crouched beside him. "He's safe here." Silas looked at her, his voice low. "So are you." She didn't look away. "I believe you." They sat then, the light nearly gone and the sky turning the color of bruised lilac. The talk around them softened to murmurs, the clink of plates being stacked, the rustle of canvas being folded. "I've been thinking on something," he said. She turned toward him, hands folded in her lap. "I've built a life steady enough to hold someone else if they wanted to stay," he said. "Not because it's owed, not because they need rescuing, just because it'd feel right." She nodded slowly. "I've wanted to belong somewhere for a long time. Not just in a house, but in a life that fits." He reached for her hand, not in question this time, but in welcome. "I want that life with you, Kenzie." She felt it then, not the rush of romance or the heat of infatuation, but something deeper, a rootedness. A home she hadn't known she was still searching for. "I want that too." Neither of them looked away. When they rose to leave, Jude stirred and mumbled something about the pie. Silas lifted him easily, settling the boy against his shoulder. The path back to the house was dim, but familiar now. Kenzie walked close, her hand brushing his sleeve, her step sure. By the time they reached the porch, the night had quieted, and the sounds of the fair faded into memory. Silas opened the door and stood aside, letting her pass through first. Inside, the lamp was still lit. The room looked the same, but it felt different now, like something had shifted from temporary to permanent with the changing of the light. Kenzie set her bonnet on the peg and turned toward him. "I never imagined I'd meet someone like you," she said. He stepped closer. "I didn't imagine it either, but I'm glad I did." She reached for his hand again, and this time he didn't let go. The morning after the fair, Silas rose early, the sky still pale behind the barn. He stepped out to the pump, splashed water over his face, and stood for a moment with his hands braced on the basin. The air smelled of damp earth and lilac, and the quiet felt different now, like something was waiting to begin, not end. Inside, the house had the stillness of sleep. Jude was curled under his quilt, one leg flung over the side of the mattress, and Kenzie's door was just barely ajar. He could see the soft edge of her shawl hanging from the hook and the faint glow of her lamp already lit. When she stepped into the kitchen a little while later, her hair was still damp at the ends, and she wore a calico skirt he hadn't seen before. She looked at him, then reached for the kettle. "Will you come with me this afternoon?" she asked as she poured. "Mrs. Ellerby's sister is passing through, and she brought a parcel of fabrics from Cheyenne, said I could pick through it if I helped with her ledgers." He leaned against the counter. "I will. I'll finish the gatepost first." Jude stumbled in before long, rubbing his eyes and asking if he could ride into town with them. Kenzie tousled his hair and told him he'd have to brush his teeth first, which earned a groan and a trudge toward the wash basin. Later, as they rode toward town, Kenzie held the reins while Silas adjusted a bundle of fence nails behind them. The road was rutted from last week's rain, but the sun was high now, and the hills beyond the fields were starting to green. "Do you miss Boston?" he asked after a while. "Not the city," she said, "but I miss knowing where I came from. I left too fast to say goodbye properly." He watched her hands on the reins. "You could write a letter, let someone know you're safe." I thought about it. "But no one back there would recognize this version of me." "I would," he said. She looked at him then, and whatever worry had been behind her eyes eased, just a little. At the shop, Mrs. Ellerby's sister turned out to be a short woman with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to hum as she wrote. Kenzie sat at the ledger table in the back room while Silas waited near the front, flipping through a newspaper more out of habit than interest. Jude knelt by the window, tracing figures in the condensation with his knuckle. An hour passed before Kenzie emerged, her arms wrapped around a small bolt of plum-colored wool. Her eyes were bright. "I've never worked with anything so fine," she said as they stepped outside. Silas helped her into the wagon. "What will you make?" "I don't know yet." "Maybe something for myself for when the weather turns." They rode home with the breeze at their backs and the road dry beneath the wheels. Jude dozed off just as they reached the house, so Silas lifted him down and carried him inside, careful not to wake him. Kenzie lingered near the porch steps, her hand resting on the railing. Silas joined her a moment later, brushing his palms on the side of his trousers. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "If I stayed," she began, "fully stayed, not just as a guest or someone passing through, what would that look like to you?" He took a breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, the band simple, the stone no more than a sliver of garnet set in a copper bezel. "I made this months ago," he said. "Before I knew what would come of you arriving. I was mending a plow and I found that stone in the soil, kept it in my workbench." She held out her hand and he placed the ring in her palm. "It's not much," he said. "It's exactly right," she said. He stepped closer. "Kenzie Calloway, will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." They stood there, the porch warm beneath their feet, and he kissed her for the first time, soft and sure, like something long understood. They married 2 weeks later in the chapel near the cottonwoods. The pews were filled with neighbors, and Jude stood between them, proud in a new vest Kenzie had sewn herself. The pastor spoke plainly, and when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, though neither of them was looking at anyone but each other. She wore a gown of that plum wool, the hem embroidered in a quiet pattern of ivy and grain. Silas had trimmed his beard and shined his boots, and when he kissed her again, it was with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was choosing. After the ceremony, they returned to the house with a basket of bread and preserves, and the three of them ate beneath the apple tree in the yard. Jude fell asleep in the grass with the dog curled beside him, and Kenzie rested her head on Silas's shoulder. That night they sat by the fire, her hand tucked in his, the room lit only by the glow of the hearth. "Are you content?" he asked. She looked around at the worn floorboards, the quiet breath of the sleeping boy down the hall, the man beside her who had never promised what he couldn't give, but had given more than she'd ever expected. "I am," she said. "I truly am." Years passed, and the house filled with new sounds, laughter, the creak of a cradle, the scrape of chairs pulled close for supper. Kenzie taught at the schoolhouse part-time, and Silas continued at the forge, his work steady as ever. They built a life that wasn't grand, but it was whole. And every evening, when the sun slipped behind the ridge, they still sat out on the porch, her hand in his, the silence between them full and warm. They never needed more than that.